So I'm here to talk about Borris House. You'll all be familiar. Some of you went on the trip to Borris a few weeks ago, and for the most part, Borris looks like an early 19th century house, a Tudor revivalist castle, with adjoining outbuildings. And you see that it's quite a simple courtyard, but when we look at it, that's quite a recent development. Borris was quite a cluster of buildings beforehand, and the wall around the perimeter there at the front, that's actually 20th century, so there wasn't anything like that before. The word, just somebody was asking me before, what was the word palimpsest? You probably know all this already. So palimpsest is a document that's worked and reworked. So in terms of Borris, Borris has been worked and reworked several times over the centuries. The title as well there says that Borris is been an occupation of the MacMurrough Kavanaghs for 4 centuries. It hasn't quite been. There's a misnomer about when they actually arrived at Borris. So what I'm going to do is go through a little bit of the early part of the family history and just about their arrival at Borris, then looking at their building of the house as we see it today, and then looking at it towards the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, and saw how bits got chopped off later on and how the whole thing was proposed to be demolished in the 20th century. So the earlier castle was at Palmanty. I don't know if you know of this. It's down near South Carlow. It's down the very, very southern point near St. Mullins. And that castle, I have a very bad image of it there, but what it is now is a cluster of farmhouses that have been built using the stone from the old castle. I'm not sure why they built it there, because there's no prospects at all from where this castle was built, but it was in the site of another castle, which was in sight of another castle as they were in medieval times, down along the river. But this is on a tributary of the Barrow. So you can see there on the map from the early 20th century, it is just a cluster of farm buildings. You can see there's 2 farmhouses and the buildings associated with them. The railway was brought through right past it. I'm not sure, was that just coincidence, or was it the fact that when Arthur was planning the arrival of the railway at Borris, was it that he brought it right past basically the home of his ancestors there? Anyway, the place is fairly forlorn now, and you can see that the buildings are all derelict. There's no actual access to it. You have to walk across fields. So you can see, in terms of where Borris is and where, sorry, this pointer, so Palmanty is right down the bottom here, and Borris is further up along the Barrow there. So the Kavanaghs had quite a lot of land in South Carlow, and it's said that, just looking at that previous slide, that they had 6 castles in the south of the county. There's no real record of Borris, which was Borris, beforehand, and when it's called Borris on later maps, you find that it's always recognised as a second residence of the Kavanaghs until about 1650. So the first man I suppose we should start with is Caer MacArt Kavanagh, and this was a gentleman who was residing at Palmanty, and he was formally renounced the MacMurrough. So the MacMurrough was the person who was the head of the family, so it was like the king of the family. So they used to fight for this. It wasn't hereditary, it wouldn't pass down through the generations. You had to fight for this, and often to the death. And Caer ended up with it anyway in the 1540s, and he renounced the MacMurrough. And when he renounced the MacMurrough, it meant that they said that he sold his soul, basically, that to the English, but he got a title in exchange for it, and it was Baron de Ballian. And Baron de Ballian is a title that exists in Austria now. It's a variation of that, and it was a descendant of his that had his lands confiscated and emigrated afterwards. But Baron de Ballian was told, basically, that he would get this title and he would be in charge of St. Mullins and the fairs there, but he had to build himself mansion there. So the proposal was that he was to build a new castle at St. Mullins, or at Palmanty, but within the year he died, and his son wasn't as agreeable, and they were back fighting again with the crown, and he lost his title. So his title was Baron de, it's Cooleyhoon or Coolaleen, I'm not sure, it's near between Graignamanagh and St. Mullins as well. So he had a title, but he lost his title on the death of his father, and they were back fighting again, so that's 1554. So if anybody's familiar with Arthur MacMurrough Kavanagh, who was born without limbs, there's a famous posthumous biography by Sarah Steele, a relative of his, and Sarah Steele says that the Kavanaghs arrived in Borris in 1570. That's the only real record of that, except for everybody else who references Sarah Steele. So Sarah Steele's work, I'm not sure what that was based on, but they didn't arrive in 1570, it was much later. So in the second half of the 16th century, the Kavanaghs, all the letters in that say of Palmanty and Borris, but what's interesting is Palmanty usually comes first. So it's at 1650, Borris and Palmanty, it's phrased the opposite way around. And there was Brian Kavanagh and Morgan Mac Brian Kavanagh. So every generation carried the father's name from the previous generation. So Morgan, son of Brian Kavanagh, 1556 to 1636. And there were serious challenges to their ownership of South Carlow and lands into Wexford. And a lot of these came from the Ormonds here in Kilkenny. And the irony of it is that they intermarried with the Ormonds thereafter. So they realised that it was probably better to be in with them than out with them. And the Kavanagh's land also, there was a challenge from Sir Peter Carew. And that resulted in lands being forfeited, but they were given back to the Kavanaghs later on, but there was a 40-year gap. But Brian Kavanagh, during that time, is said to have acquired English notions and ideas. And he realised that if he remained a Protestant, he could keep his lands at Borris. He had 3 younger brothers who didn't do that, and their lands were confiscated. So I suppose he had learned from that. So the lands at Borris, you can see here just unforfeited lands called Borris, belonging to Mr. Brian Kavanagh, Protestant, 505 acres there. There's lots of plots of land around, but you can see that there, I'm not sure do I have it on this now, but there's other Kavanaghs. I think there's another Kavanagh mentioned somewhere on that, and Edmund Kavanagh with a C there, and his lands were confiscated, 163 acres. So a lot of the relatives of the Kavanaghs were confiscated. A lot of those branches have ended up in Austria mostly, some in Germany, and quite a few in South America and that as well. So there are branches of the Kavanagh, and there's all variations of spelling of Kavanagh that you find globally. And most of them are descended from these families that left. A lot of land was bought up by Simon Newport, who owned a bank he owned New Park House in Waterford, and owned he was a bank basically in Waterford. There's a portrait of him in the museum in Waterford, and he bought up a lot of these lands. So lands were assigned to various soldiers and that, but a lot of them didn't take up residence and often sold their interests within 10 years. And Simon Newport, as I said, was bankable after that. The Earl of Courtown ended up acquiring an awful lot of estates around this. And the Bagnalls were dispossessed of a lot of their lands and that at this time as well. Now, you'll find that it's Morgan, Brian for generations. Quite confusing, but I'm going to skip through these, just give you an idea, though, that the Butlers, they started interconnecting with the Butlers quite early on. And Eleanor Butler married Morgan, and she was the daughter of Edmund Butler, 2nd Viscount Mountgarrett, and his seat was the Ballyragget estate. So there's actually records of where he added grand room to the castle at Ballyragget. Apparently traces of it are still visible, but I didn't see it in the farmyard. It's there at the moment. But it's inaccessible more or less at the moment. But there's a grand room, and there's supposed to be remains of plasterwork from that period. So she arrived at Borris, and when I say at Borris, there was a castle in a rental from about 1830, and it refers to the old castle at Borris. But there's all sorts of confusion about who might have built that. It's believed that it might have been built by the Kinsella family, and that the Kavanaghs basically stole the Kinsella castle, but there's no real record of that apart from records from the Kinsellas. And the estate that was there, that ended up coming into Kavanagh ownership. I'll explain that later on. That's at Ballyragget. Brian McMurrough Kavanagh of Borris and Palmanty married Eleanor Coakley, even though it looks like Codlot, but that's Coakley, daughter of Sir Thomas Coakley of Tintern Abbey in Clonmines. And after his first wife had died, he married Eleanor Blancheville of Blancheville here in Kilkenny. Now, it was their son who did most of the work at Borris. So he married this lady here. And this lady, her portrait is at Borris. It's by Mary Beale. And this is Mary Walsh. And it's of Piltown, County Waterford. And a lot of people think, obviously, there's a Piltown in County Kilkenny. But this is Piltown there near Youghal. And you'll see there's actually a sign somewhere along that main road to Cork for the castle. It's a tower house that's there. And she was the youngest daughter of this family. So when she actually arrived at Borris, she didn't have a huge amount of money. A lot of her siblings died thereafter. And she ended up inheriting a lot of her father's income, which apparently was made from importing brandy legally into Cork. And his wife was Ellen, daughter of John Parr, the 5th Lord de la Puer of Curramore. And when she brought this money to Borris, it was said that her father said, I think you find this with lots of houses, that the house wasn't good enough for her and he wanted her to be kept in the manner that she was accustomed to. So they set about building a new house. And the Borris house that you see today is basically that house. The house was as high as it is today. And how we know that is There are beams in the attic that are inscribed 1665, and I know that you can write something on a beam thereafter, but as dendrochronology shows that those beams are from that period. Also, there's traces of the ceilings up in the attic. So whatever happened over the years, they changed ceiling heights. So the ceilings must have been higher at one point. It was probably a piano nobile that they were living at first floor level, and they had higher rooms above, and then they brought down ceilings in bedrooms later on. So you can actually see traces of this 17th century plasterwork upstairs, which was probably a bedroom, so it's not very decorative, but it is at least 17th century. This is the only representation which has since been lost. So what happened was somebody came out from the Irish Architecture Archive in the 80s and recorded lots of the images and that in the archive at Borris. And this was a vignette in the corner of a map, and the map has since disappeared, so it's not sure where it is. But this shows Borris House as it was, more or less, in the early 18th century. And you can see that you have the two towers there, and you have the castle standing as 3 stories, quite clearly that. And you also have the lock here down at Clashganny, or maybe the lock just below the house. Wherever the lock is, you definitely can't see the house from any of the locks, so it's an artist's impression of what's going on. But the interesting thing, I suppose, about it is that there are only 2 towers, and the house faced the Barrow, whereas now the house faces the Blackstairs. So at that point, they were facing Mount Brandon in County Kilkenny, and later on, they turned the house around. But what I've shown here is, underneath that red square there are the basements of the house. They extend right out underneath the grounds here. So I had students a couple of years ago take measurements from basically the steps that descend into the basement out to the end of where the wall is in the front of the dungeons, basically. And the castle did definitely extend out there. There's also traces that there were outbuildings out in the field out here. But as I said, the house faced out in that direction, out to the left, which meant that there wasn't an entrance here and that there could have been a courtyard or that behind the building, or at least beside the building. One of the big things was that, it's believed at least, that they moved the house around because when they turned the house around, everything that they could see, they owned. So if you brought somebody up to your front door and you looked out, you saw everything, the mountain included, that they owned everything towards Wexford, whereas towards Kilkenny they didn't. Whatever the reason was, it was moved around. But anyway, unusually, they left the basement there. So if you're ever parking there, it's reassuring now that you're parking over a basement. But there's all the vaults and that are underneath. So I'm often scared when you see a bus or that arriving in, parked up on top of it. But these were dungeons. When I say basement, it's not like the kitchens in an old castle or that, or an old country house. These were actual dungeons, and there's traces of metal and things on walls where people were withheld. Maybe the kinsellas that I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure, but people at least were held in there. I'll come back to the church and that later. But this man came along, and this Largillier portrait of Brian Kavanagh, painted in France in the mid-17th century, and you could see there that, or 1720, should I say, you could see there this portrait, it hangs over the mantelpiece in the dining room at Borris, and he wasn't afraid to show his Jacobite roots there with that wig, and there are traces that it may have been painted over at one point. So what might have happened was you have your Jacobite wig and then you come back to Borris, and then you're supposed to be a Protestant, and you have your portrait changed, that your wig was changed, so it was taken off at a later stage, the paint that was over that. But anyway, whatever the reason was, he had his portrait painted. The frame is believed not to have belonged to this portrait originally, and there's a butler crest in that there, which doesn't make sense. It's slightly later, the frame is. And it may have been that his grandson, Walter, had that, or great-grandson, had it modified. Just showing you the blue square there, showing where the entrance was. So if you're ever in Borris and you're in the drawing room, there have been serious issues structurally recently with a beam that was on the move. And the beam was on the move because it replaced, shall I say, the wall that was on the left-hand side of the entrance hall when you went into Borris. So if you go through that window, there's a wall to your right, and then to your left would have been another wall. But they removed that and put in a big oak beam, but didn't remove the wall on the upper levels. So you can imagine there's 2 or 3 stories of wall pushing down on it. So that's been pinned recently, and they had to take out parts of the walls on the upper levels to lighten the load on that. You also see that there are 3 towers now. I'll come back to that in a while as well. And the entrance, as I said, was moved around. So it's very basic this now. It's just giving you an idea at least. So the entrance to the castle was there pre-1731. You had these buildings extending out either side. There's a basement there that I'm not sure what was over that at that point, but whatever was there had disappeared more or less by 1731. And then these buildings were demolished in 1731 and the other buildings were incorporated into the house. The entrance then is added to that side, but when you add there and you want symmetry, you need another tower. So the third tower was added at that point. The courtyard was later filled in by Sir Richard Morrison. So Sir Richard Morrison was commissioned around 1812, 1813 to remodel the house. And when he was brought to the house, one of the big things was that there wasn't a grand staircase, but yet there was this obvious space for a grand staircase, which was the courtyard. So there's a well just beyond that, and the well apparently was moved to make way for this. And renovation works in the last 20 years of that revealed openings in the wall in the stairwell. So when they took off the plaster, you could see where windowsills had been cut off, and also where windows had just been blocked up. Some of the windows were actually still present, the frames were. And the service wing and chapel were added in 1813. So it was added initially as a Catholic chapel for Walter Kavanagh, and within 7 years it was a Church of Ireland church, and then later on became the Church of Ireland Church for Borris, or the parish of Clunigoose, once the other church in the parish around 1854 fell into disrepair, and it was decided, rather than repair the building, that they were going to move everything to Borris. Now, they kept extending and extending and extending, and that's where the problem lay in the 20th century. They keep adding to it, and then they want to bring it back and make it more manageable. And work started there in 1876, so they were actually progressive up until about 1876. That project failed. I'll show you that in a short while. They didn't get around to it. So that's just, you saw that if you were down at Borris. There's kind of a conglomerate of buildings, and they're all made look like a fanciful castle, but when you look closely at it, you can see the 18th century roof, quite high pitch, very reminiscent of houses of the early 1700s that you would see without parapets. All of those details were just added. So you can see even things like the parapets that were added here, but they're not on the back of the church because nobody was ever going to see that. You can also see the laundry building there. This was just added at the front because you can see it from the avenue, but no detail was added to the back of that. So it's a facade, basically. This map was commissioned in 1837 for Thomas Kavanagh. It's his estates. He actually died in that year as well. So this was Thomas Kavanagh II. He's called just Thomas Kavanagh. His father's called Fat Thomas, so it's easy to distinguish between the two of them. And you could see this conglomerate of buildings still in the courtyard at that point. So this is the nice stable range at the top of the yard. And then you have all of these buildings. And you have the church here, and there's a building beyond that again. But if you're ever there, you'll see there's a courtyard there at the laundry, the bleach green, basically it was called. And there's a range of buildings there beside that, but you can see there's a wall there, and there's openings in it that were slits or arrow slits. They may have just been vents into farm buildings, but whatever they were, they're now forming a garden wall as opposed to a wall of a building. And you can also see that there's all sorts of access routes to the house, and that wall that I was showing you earlier doesn't exist at that point. The stable range was built before the house was built, and the reason, when I say the house was built, rebuilt in 1813, and the reason for that was that in 1798 the house was attacked, and when it was attacked, it was protected by the Donegal militia. So there were 13 men stationed in the house, and 2,000 men marched from Lacken in New Ross, or near New Ross, to Borris, hoping to steal gunpowder and guns, etc. But they obviously had a lot of warning because all the windows were bricked up in the house on the ground floor, and they were protecting the house from the first floor. They also bricked up the basement at that point, which wasn't actually opened until the 1930s again. But they had hidden all the whiskey and the Madeira behind it, and the man who owned it at the time liked whiskey but didn't like Madeira, so the Madeira still exists, or a lot of it still exists, and obviously has kept because it's fortified. But they built up that, and they have regalia. I'm sure you've heard of the family regalia. There's a charter horn and brooch and that, and they were all given to a family locally, which lived in Kilcoltram House. And there's a record of that, and then they've since ended up in the National Museum. But at that point, they were obviously well prepared that somebody was going to attack them, and they had moved out. But in their attack, the rebels decided, well, we'll be clever about this, and we'll set the stables on fire, and we'll set all the outbuildings on fire. And what will happen is the Donegal militia will come out to defend or protect the buildings, but they didn't. And then they brought a cart even up to the front door with mattresses and straw, set it alight, didn't do anything. And eventually they gave up. But they had burnt the outbuildings, which meant they had to be rebuilt first. So at that point, Sir Richard Morrison was brought to Borris, and this is one of his first buildings. There's no real record of that, but it's very similar to the stable yard at Castle Cool, which he had worked at in the 1800s as well. And it's possible that he was working on the two of them at the same time. This is clad in granite. The one at Castle Cool is rendered, but very, very similar, that double height or joint order arch there. And you can see these were stalls for horses there, and this is visible from the back of the house. Anyway, Morrison was brought back then to do work on the house, and you can see there, this is a photograph from, it's actually pre-1880, and the door of the church is there, which was later moved up, and it was moved up because there was an organ put in where the door is into the church now. So if you were in the church recently, you'll find the steps are very steep, and it's not very accessible. It wasn't like that, I'd imagine, at one point. There was no door even in that column that's there at that point, so that was put in afterwards. You can see also there are cupolas on the top of the towers here. Those cupolas were lead clad. They were built in timber. But Andrew remembers moving those off in the 1970s, as in, well, they had moved themselves off, and he took them down the rest of the way. And he also remembers having worked onto some of the chimneys at that point as well, as in the chimneys were on the move as well. But you can see the back of the house. These photographs were taken by Osborne Kavanagh. He was the son of Arthur McMurray Kavanagh. He was an amateur photographer. He took some photographs. You just wish he took a bit more to the left, a bit more to the right some of the times. But anyway, he took some at least. But none of this exists now. So all of that has been demolished. And the ballroom is there, and there's a nice chimney that's here that must have come off of one of these. Anyway, whatever happened, that's the nursery wing, if you're familiar with the house that's there now. And you can see the cupola is quite obvious there. But all of these kitchen quarters and that were demolished later. We'll come back to those. And you can also see the wall isn't visible there, and the avenue swept around to the front of the house. There's a record in 1813, in February 1813, when Walter Kavanagh, who owned the house then, Walter was a bachelor around 53 at that point when he started work on the house. This is in 1813, and this is by Thomas Kirk stonecutters in Dublin, who were responsible for Nelson's column and that around the same time. And he said that, unfortunate choice of phrase, but he said, I'm going to Dublin to see Kirk cut my arms. But obviously he was referring to Kirk cutting his armorial. And this is done in a much softer stone than the granite around it. So it has suffered over the years. So you can see there's a crack and it's on the move a lot. There's a steel plate and that behind it now. But at least it has survived. It hasn't dissolved fully. But you can see the family crest. You can see the lunar, moon, the lion. And you can see the sheaf of wheat there. And also, that, quite unusual, that the family motto is in Irish there. And I suppose post-1798, everyone was feeling a little bit vulnerable. And he was trying to say that we are an ancient Irish family. And here we are. And, putting his motto up there in Irish. When you start looking at the house closely, you start seeing that the 18th century bits were obviously integral to the building of the house, as in that they were incorporated into the house. It became part of the house, as in the stone architraves around the windows. But then when Morrison came along, they weren't going to do all of this in stone. It would be far too expensive and too complex. So everything was done in plaster. And you can imagine something like that plaster has a lifespan. And the lifespan of that turned out to be about 150 years. So what happened is a lot of them on the west and south side had dissolved. If you're ever on the north side of the house at the church side, you see most of them have disappeared. And they've been replacing them over the years. So a lot of these are probably recreations of what was there previously. But you can see that the crest again is repeated, and repeated everywhere throughout the house. These are nobody in particular. People ask who are they, but they're nobody in particular, just models of the day. And you can see again even the lunar again, the lion's mask, and the sheaf of wheat again, and that's repeated throughout. You also have the Greek key. So that seems to be quite important in a lot of entrance halls, that you have the Greek key, the dynasty going on and on. Well, unless it hits a column, but the dynasty is supposed to go on and on forever and ever. Now, when you start looking at the house, you start seeing that there are parts of it that don't make sense. So if you look at that where I've highlighted there, or look at any of those, with coin stones, you expect one to go in one direction, the next one to go in the opposite direction, and so forth. But when you get to here, you have one going that way, one going that way, one not doing anything, and then they're back again in order. So what happens is, Morrison comes along, wants to add all of these hoods to these windows, but there's actually a string course that runs around the house that clashes with them all. So the easiest thing to do is rip it out. So what they do is they ripped out all the granite coins across there, or the string course should I say, so that they could add these, and then kind of repaired the damage with an odd stone in each of these. And you can see it in all of them. From this, I was saying to you, in 1731 they moved the entrance around, but when they were doing the ceiling in this ensuite, well, it wasn't an ensuite, I'm sure, a dressing room we'll call it, in more recent times, the cornice runs right through the room. So it meant that it was external at one point, and then it became internal in 1731. You also see that the entrance, as I said, was there, and you have nice low windowsills there, which you wouldn't have had in the 18th century. So if you look at the windowsill height there, it's probably more typical of what you would expect. You also find that because Morrison added detail to these, all of these windowsills have been extended in line. So there's granite for the central part, and then there's a little bit added on at each end. And all of that works very well for a couple of years, but the repairs mostly, or the money for conservation, mostly goes into repairing the plasterwork on the front of this, not the stonework, because the stonework granite doesn't need major repair. You can also see here that you have the string course that I was saying ran around here, wasn't removed there because there was no need to remove it there. So you have the detail from the 18th century that's visible still there. I was also saying to you that that area was filled in by Morrison to create this stairwell, and by doing so, what happened is that string course, or eaves course, should I say, at that level there, runs inside, and there's a room upstairs in the attic above you can see the window there. So when you're in that room, you can actually see the cornice running in around the room. So it was external at one point, and now it's internal. Where this stone ended up, nobody knows. You'd imagine you might use it as curbing or something around the gardens, but it hasn't ended up there. Although a huge amount of stone was removed to the rectory in Gorn in the 1950s. So what Andrew's grandmother, Minna Alice, was living at the rectory in Gorn, and she brought lots of things from Borris and left them in the garden there, and they're still in the garden there. And there's even a pond surrounded at Borris, and half it is at Borris and half it is in Gorn. So you can have half a pond in each place, but you can't. So maybe some of this stone ended up there. So anything that was loose, basically, and columns. There's some columns there, and there's also some chimneys that ended up there as well. The stairwell, that's showing the stairwell now. There's a cantilevered Portland stone stairwell there, so it must have been quite a feat of engineering to actually put that into walls that already existed. It's believed to extend into the walls about 90 centimetres, so it's quite a distance in. You can see the window there as well. You probably saw that with the coat of arms, which Lady Harriet had commissioned for Thomas in 1826. And it was unusual that she didn't actually have her own coat of arms there, that she used his first wife's coat of arms in that window that was created for him. He was moving up the political ranks in Carlow, Kilkenny at the time, and I suppose when you see the Butler crest, it was more of a prominent, more recognisable crest than maybe the Earls of Cloncarty at the time. This balustrade is cast iron. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's actually supporting the stairs. So the stairs are so broad that it's believed that if this handrail or balustrade wasn't there, that these are likely to sink. So that's actually acting like a beam, and these are suspended from that. So it's unusual as well. You'll see a similar motif in Kilruddery, not in cast iron, in timber, and the same in the church. I don't know if this is a compliment or not, but we'll read it anyway. John Preston Neal's 1819 assessment of the house said that it is of the period of Henry VIII, of which period, though so many beautiful examples are extant in England, yet in this country Borris may be considered as unique. Now, why I say is this a compliment or not? According to the records, Walter was trying to ascertain himself as this Irish landlord, and this was a purely Irish house. And then somebody comes along and says that it's a great example of Henry VIII architecture in Carlow. What is interesting, I suppose, about this is the wall is there in the image, the wall that now exists, that didn't exist at this time. You also have some Carlow fence. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Carlow fence. It has granite uprights and horizontals in granite. And then you have a spire of a church there. Nearest church in that direction is probably Bagnallstown, which is about 11 kilometres from there. So it's quite artist's impression. So when you're looking at details, like the hoods are all the same on the windows, you can't start to say, well, this is an exact record. I'd imagine Neil might have never visited that, or if he did a sketch, or he got a sketch from somebody and imagined what was going on around it. The house, all the windows are more or less the same size as well, and they're all casement windows. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Now, Morrison, as I said, did an awful lot of work in 1813, but came back to the house then in 1826. So what happens? 1813, Walter 53, doing a lot of work on the house. Nobody knows why, because the house was damaged in 1798. If you were doing work, you should have done it around 1800. He did come into the Butler estates at that time, and it was believed that the Butler estates might have brought an awful lot of wealth to him. It did in the forthcoming years, or to the family, but he did have to pay £30,000 to inherit that. So George Butler, younger brother of Robert of Ballyragget, died in Bath in 1813, so the dates do add up, but he had a daughter, and she was married to a Mostyn, and she, as part of the settlement, was to get £30,000, and then they inherited the Butler estates at Ballyragget. So I suppose there was this potential for huge income coming in thereafter. He set about this, and his brother was then living at, as in his younger brother, Thomas, was living at Ballyragget. Thomas and Lady Elizabeth Butler were living at Ballyragget, and when they were living at Ballyragget, they made great improvements there. So that's Ballyragget Lodge. You might know that on the way into Ballyragget. It still exists. I think it's a centre, it's Ashling Centre or something it's called. No, sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So when they were living at Ballyragget, there's records at Borris that they were making improvements to the woodland and that there. When you read through the records, the reason why the Kavanaghs got this land, the Butlers didn't have any Butler cousins at that point, and they were getting this land and these estates because they were Catholic. And the Kavanaghs at that point reverted to being Catholic. In the man with the wig, as I showed you, he sent his sons to the continent to school. And this generation as well, Walter went to Liège in Belgium to school, and he came home, and then his cousins, as in Robert, basically made it clear that if there was no Kavanagh heir, or no Butler heir, the lands would revert to the Kavanaghs. And that did happen, and 5 years later Walter died, and turns out he was a Protestant all along. And he was buried in St. Mullins, and as he was being buried in St. Mullins, the rector was basically attacked during the service, and they couldn't complete the service, and the local parish priest was pushed in, and there was a standoff, and he was buried anyway, at least, in the church in St. Mullins. Now, his brother then, Thomas, who was his Protestant brother, they always had one Protestant, one Catholic, so at least somebody could hang on to the lands. And Thomas died 10 years later, a Protestant, but turned out to be a Catholic. And he was buried outside the door of the church in St. Mullins, so his grave is unmarked. So quite interesting how they just jumped ship whenever they needed to. And this gate then, just to go back, he died in 1837, but a few years before that, he re-enlightened, I suppose, his political career. He married Lady Harriet Delaporte Trench, and Lady Harriet was 25 when she married Thomas Kavanagh, who was in his 50s at that point. So the previous year, in December, on the 14th of December 1814, or 1824 should I say, Lady Elizabeth died at Kilkenny Castle, aged 48, after giving birth to her 12th child. So they were desperate for a second heir. So there was 11 daughters and one son. And that son, Walter, was unhealthy from a young age. So the following February, so 8 weeks after his wife died, he remarried his daughter's friend, and who was Lady Harriet Delaporte Trench. And she married into Borris and took on the 12 children and went on to have 4 more children of her own. And she had 3 sons and 1 daughter, the youngest son being Arthur, who was born without limbs. And the first work that she did, she didn't bring a huge dowry with her because he already had a son, and it was unlikely that the Earl Clancarty's grandson was ever going to be the head of Borris, but it turned out he did afterwards. So she didn't actually bring a huge dowry with her. So they were still working off of Wansford money that was coming from Castlecomer, and they owned some of the collieries there, and at 1/4 share in an estate in Cork belonged to the Wansfords as well. And one of the first things they did was built this gate. And this gate, if you're familiar with it, it's undergoing restoration at the moment. The gates arrived back today, they're red, so you'll see they're quite different looking to the blue gates that were there before. This gate here, or door, if you're ever at Borris, is quite an anomaly. It's actually built in granite. So it's made look like a Tudor Revivalist door, but it's actually carved in granite. And this building is very similar to the entrance to Thomastown Castle in County Tipperary. And the Matthews of Thomastown Castle actually sued Morrison afterwards because they obviously drove through Borris at some point and realised that their gate was not unique. even though they had paid for a unique or bespoke gate. But you can see anyway that the entrance is built like a tower house. But Borris House is there, the village is here, but you entered at the bottom of the street, around there, around the Fenner Road, and you also entered up at the Factory Cross, which is way up further. But there was no entrance actually on the main street per se. So this was one of the first things they did, was built this, and there was a huge amount of silver bought at the time. So most of the silver that's at Borris now actually was bought around this time in 1826. But it was interesting, she was actually buying second-hand silver in London, second-hand Dublin silver in London at the time, and having the crests added to it. She did an awful lot of work in the house as well. And if you have a large house like that and you need a library, it's maybe not the best idea at that point, at least, to start adding another room onto it. So what they did was they carved up 2 rooms that were there already and made the library space. So the library's on the first floor level, which you would have seen when you were on that trip. And when you're inside, the old ceiling of the bedroom is actually up above the new ceiling that Morrison created. So he's created this false ceiling underneath, and yet you have an 18th century ceiling above that, and a 17th century ceiling above that again. So they didn't get rid of the ceilings. You can see the church there. I'll come back to that in a second. But there was work done on the church at that point as well. So that's the library. Now, this is supposed to have been supplied by Mac, Williams and Gipton. There were Williams and Gipton at that point. They probably were supplied by Williams and Gipton. But either the builder or the person fitting the bookcases, at least, got the measurements all mixed up. So sorry, class hours, yeah. But what they are, the worst fitted bookcases in Ireland. What happens is they don't meet right at the corners. I'd imagine that the cabinet maker came along and was told, you're going to be able to fit them into the wall this much. They came along and they couldn't fit them in this much. So what happens then is they're all sticking out. You can also see there's a narrow bookcase there, a broad one there, but the panel above are the wrong way around. So the plaster must have existed beforehand. So they should be swapped. These should be swapped. They don't meet right at the corners. They don't open right at the corners, etc., etc. So I'd say it looked very good on a plan, but it didn't look so good when they fitted it. A lot of people that had looked at it said, they must have bought second-hand bookcases. But the bookcases are contemporary to 1826, so they didn't buy second-hand bookcases. I'd imagine the room, the plaster, everything was ready. They were waiting and waiting and waiting on Williams and Gipton to finish the bookcases. They eventually arrived, and I said, to hell with it, we're not sending them back. We'll put up with them. No refunds, exactly, yes. So the church, I was saying the balustrade is similar there. It's in oak, but it's quite similar to the balustrade that's in cast iron in the house. You can see the door was there. That's not a door. The door is now there. So the organ was added you can see the organ there, is to commemorate Eva Francis, a daughter of Arthur, who died in the 1880s. So the next big ambitious plan came from Arthur. So Arthur inherited in the 1850s. So what had happened, I said to you, he had 3 older brothers. Walter, his stepbrother, died around 1820 in Italy. Turns out he may have had cancer. But Lady Harriet brought him to Italy for about 6 months, and his health didn't improve, so he was brought home to die at Borris. He was only about 18. And the house then was to revert, to Thomas Kavanagh, his eldest stepbrother, and Thomas contracted TB on the way to Australia and died at sea and was buried at sea. And the tutor at the time didn't tell Lady Harriet, and they kept sending money out to him, and he's gradually improving, and etc., etc. And eventually the tutor ended up, Reverend Woods ended up with a premature death as well, not because of Lady Harriet now, but because of whatever, he contracted something when he arrived in Australia. And then the next brother, Charles, in 1853, had an epileptic fit in Borris and fell into the fire. And in order to put out the fire, he jumped into bed, but the sheets and everything stuck to him, and he died 2 days, should I say, later from the wounds there. So Arthur, who was then in Pakistan, I think at that time, I'm right with that, or Iran, Pakistan, I can't remember, he was working there. They sent for him, but he was like the most important person in the world to them at that point because he was the last remaining heir. So he came back to Borris, and his father had died in 1837. He pretty much took over the workings of Borris straight away. There's quite a lot of documentation about how he's making improvements at Ballyraggett Lodge so that Lady Harriet can go live there. So Lady Harriet moved there in the 1850s and saw out her days at Ballyraggett Lodge. He was living here at Borris with his wife Frances, and they had 7 children here. And they were obviously running out of bedrooms, so he decided that he was going to add more bedrooms to the house. And you can see he started his work here. So this is the ballroom. It did exist on previous images of the house and that as well, but not in this form. And he started this. And everybody needed a big ben at the time. So he needed a 4-story clock tower and a bedroom wing, and also a range of rooms here, which I'll show you the floor plan in a second. Interestingly, the architect, it's 1876. William Vitruvius Morrison is long dead at this stage, as in the son of Richard. So whoever this William Morrison is, nobody knows. He's not related. There is a William Morrison recorded as a Scottish architect, amateur architect at the time. He could have been a friend of the family, I'm not sure. Whoever it was, anyway, he signed the drawings, 1876, but nobody knows exactly who he was. There was a door there where there's a bathroom at the moment. The wing has started, and you can see the base of the tower there, but they didn't quite get to finish it. That's quite blurry now, but you'll see that the door, there's a back stairs, there's a study, billiards room, armoury, and toilets and that there. So this is now the ballroom, and if you're ever in the ballroom, you can see where those walls, they start, well, this one in particular, the end of it is just jutting out from the wall there. So they did actually start the work, but they never actually finished it. Fortunately, I suppose, because very shortly afterwards, they were starting knocking bits off of the house. So this was 1876. Now, this is quite a long-winded letter. I only transcribed it recently. But it just gives you an idea of what was happening quite quickly after that. So that's 1876. Arthur dies in the 1880s. His son takes over, and his son has married Miss Buxton, Minna Alice Buxton. And Minna Alice has come from Scotland or Northern England and Scotland to Ireland. And she's writing here to her mother, and she's writing from Ballyraggett Lodge. But it just says, "Dearest mother, I got back yesterday after 2 days at Borris, and Arthur went on to Mount Juliet to hunt. I stayed a night at Borris, which was quite comfortable, and I should have enjoyed it as usual if I had found things more peaceful, should I say. The house was all right, but except for that, things could hardly have been worse. About 50 Republicans had raided the village on Monday night. The post office and several shops were broken into and robbed. 2 good houses belonging to Arthur were burnt, and a few nights before another party took 12 of our fat sheep. All the village people assure us that Borris House will be next to be burnt." So I set to work and packed up all I could and filled the motor with pictures, etc. 2 grandmothers I failed to put in, so I thrust them into the old Brockham in the coach house, rather than let them go back into the house. I filled 3 slop pails with the rest of the silver that had been left in the safe, and waste paper baskets full of some good china, but I couldn't do more than that, for if I took out the rest of the furniture, everyone would hear of it, and they would be even more likely to burn it. And they said, "I shall go again on Monday or Tuesday to put some more things away. It will be too horrible if it is burnt, but there is absolutely nothing we can do." So interesting, insightful at the time. And it was proposed to be burnt. There were several attempts to burn the house, but it wasn't burnt. It was not burnt apparently, as in recently on the Freedom of Information, some of the transcripts arose that indicated that because the Cavaliers were very good to the people of Borris during the famine and etc., that it wasn't burnt as a result of that. But it was touch and go whether or not it would have been burnt at that point. Now, she saved obviously the silver and the portraits. I'm not sure whether they ever brought back in because all the grandmothers seem to be missing. So some of them at least disappeared. But I'm showing you this image here. This is in the drawing room. It's actually taken before it's repainted. But it just shows at the same time she was going off buying furniture and fireplaces from other houses that were being burnt. So this is Castleborough House in Wexford. She bought this, just show you the house there. You can see the 2 images of it. It's a Daniel Robertson building. The house is now like this. It was burnt in 1923. But beforehand, they had an 8-day auction of all the contents of the house. And Minna Alice went and bought this and a hunt table. There's a hunt table at Borris as well. So you can see it's badly fitted. There was supposed to be an alabaster example before that. And you can see it is fitted right now. I used this photograph because it's perfect now. But you can see that somebody made good all the plasterwork and details around it. But it was obviously an 18th century mantelpiece. It's much taller and narrower than its counterpart that existed beforehand. So she bought this and bought the table back from Castleborough, as I say. The house is missing a big chunk here, and that chunk is missing as a result of works that happened in the 1950s. So when you get an architect in the 1950s to give you advice, they give you three options. First option, to let Borris House and build a small house adjacent, to demolish rear sections of Borris House and take down the top story of the main house. It extends to put on an asphalt roof, mass concrete top and an asphalt roof, and to demolish Borris House and build a small house adjacent, and had the drawings ready for that small house, a 4-bedroom bungalow, which was supposed to go in the wall garden, and was getting all the planning permission, etc., ready, and the trustees at the time said, let's slow down a minute, we'll make a decision, and very pushy with the detail in saying that the cost of building goes up every day, the cost of building a new bungalow, but your house is worth nothing, but you need to build a new bungalow. It's quite contradictory when you read through the whole thing. But these are just some of the things that I've taken out of it. Perhaps I will be forgiven if I say that Borris House is not an architectural gem. Within one of these was to completely remove the front portico. I do not think the general appearance of the house would suffer by its removal. His big thing was to remove the parapets because they were the biggest problem, remove the roof, and an asphalt roof could be swept. So if you had leaves on your roof, you could sweep the entire roof instead of cleaning the gutters. And to invite tenders from demolition contractors, and that was the first option. And second, to auction it room by room or floor by floor and employ one's own contractor on the demolition. It was coincidental that this architect was restoring a house in South Kilkenny at the same time, and Belline House, I think you might know of that, so that work was going on at the same time. So I suppose things have changed quite a lot, and thankfully that there were trustees put in place. So what happened was Joan McMurrough Kavanagh, or Andrew's mother, had her 3 brothers-in-law as trustees at the time, so any decisions had to go through at least 4 people, so that was good, at least things were teased out at least. And it was decided to demolish the wing at that point, so they started doing that, but it actually cost quite a lot, and they had an auction, and I found the receipts of it about 2 years ago, of all the things that were bought, and I found that somebody had bought chimneys from it, and then I realised where he lived, and I drove by the house recently enough, and you can see that the chimneys have formed part of an entrance, so use the pillars, or the chimneys as piers going into the house. It's kind of quirky. And the other things that were bought, like windows and tables and whatever, deal boards, steel beams, etc., were all bought, and a lot of them were bought locally. That's the wing, just showing you where it's demolished. But when you have a house like this that has a basement that doesn't have kitchens and that in it, the house was without a kitchen, and I'll come back to that now in 1 second. But the cupolas, as I said, were removed at that point. The 2 of those, no trace of them now. I don't know where they put in storage or what, but there's no trace of them. You always wonder what happened when people took something out of a house. Why didn't they just put it in the shed and just leave it there? As in, there were so many doors that must have been taken out of the house in the 1830s or 1820s as well, and they just disappeared. That's the wing that disappeared. The wall appeared there in the 20th century, but as I said, it was without a kitchen, so this became the kitchen. Thankfully, there's no trace of it now, but there was a false ceiling put in here to protect the ceiling. The aga was put in here, and the end of the room was cordoned off as a utility room. And if you're ever in there, the scagliola column here has marks on it where there was actually a clothesline hanging from side to side. And it was to dry horse rugs, apparently. And somebody visiting in the 1960s commented that it was the grandest utility room in Ireland. And thankfully that has been removed. And this, thankfully, I say people didn't store things, but they actually stored that. There's Ionic capitals on those, and I was surveying a dog pen, and one of them, I tripped over one of them, pulled it up, and it was the Ionic column from this. Then another one surfaced, and then Andrew remembered that there was parts of this under stairs, and all this chimney piece was actually found as the original chimney piece that was removed in obviously sections, and people put it in various locations. So the chimney piece that was there was moved from the music room, which now became the kitchen, and or the breakfast room, should I say, it's now become the kitchen. So they're kind of on rotation, but that one has just gone in the last 2 years, but it's been restored and all the pieces are complete. And I suppose it's nice to see that it's gone full circle. The house was going forward, then it started going backwards, and now it's going forwards again. And a lot of restoration work is happening, and the current generation are very interested in putting back what is there, what's belonging to there. They are still minus a good kitchen, but work is in progress to fit that in the nursery wing. The ground floor of the nursery wing has the commercial kitchens, etc. The house, as I said, the dining room was restored, the kitchen was moved into the other room, and the chimney piece that was taken out of there will be put in thereafter. This is a drawing, it's a naive drawing from 1835. It was on a Christmas card. Just shows, nobody has signed it or anything. Just gives you an idea. They're obviously very fond of drapes and things on windows, but you could see a very decorative Borris. So that's a synopsis of whistle stop tour, should I say, of the history of Borris House, the building at least of Borris House.